course and what it's going to offer to you to help you be successful with vCloud Director. Now, first, I've got to give you a couple of tips, I guess, some assumptions that I'm going to make about your skill set and your environment that will help you be successful with this course. Now, I give 2 skill set requirements in order to be effective with this course. You'll need to have experience with the VMware vSphere 5.x, and obviously, if you've got vSphere, you've got esxi because the ESX Classic is retired in 5.x. So there's going to be an assumption that you understand how to install and configure most of the advanced features within vSphere, such as DRS and HA and setting up standard switches and things like that. So preferably, a year or 2 of experience with vSphere will really help you out, because the vCloud product lays on top of all of that, all those guts that you've learned in vSphere. The vSphere environment is going to form the platform that the vCloud environment will live upon. So just like when you're building a house, you need a strong foundation of vSphere knowledge in order to build this cloud. And I do expect that you have some basic networking knowledge, specifically around layer 2, which is mostly that you understand what subnetting is, what IP gateways are, so that you can get out of your subnet and go to layer 3, and things like that. I will try to explain as much as I can, but it will really help if you at least know the basics of layer 2 networking. And I kind of have a question mark. Do you have a lab? Hopefully you do, and we'll go over, there's an entire lesson on building a home lab, but I definitely recommend getting a lab of some sort. I'm not talking about blowing $10,000 on great hardware or anything, but having a way that you can follow along with the video will really give you a great grasp of what you're seeing on the screen. So instead of just watching it, if you hear it and you read it and then you do it, the retention rate is off the charts compared to just seeing it. And VMware provides evaluation software for everything you're going to see here. So you can, from a software perspective, you could really follow along with all the videos without having to invest practically anything in software. It should just mostly be maybe a little hardware, maybe VMware workstation, things like that. So the key question becomes, what makes something a cloud? And this is something I've kind of poked fun at here and there, because over the last several years, the term cloud has been abused in some ways by different folks and different vendors. It really boils down to having these key phrases met by the environment that you're building. And I've got them kind of ranked by level of importance. So on demand is a very important phrase that should be used in an environment that's considered a cloud. It should be something that can be scaled up and down without any significant level of effort on the user's behalf. It should be a very automated process, and that ties into self-service. The user should be able to provision the resources they need to do their job, or to, build a server to do development on relatively on their own, with very little interaction from the back-end team. It should be a pool of resources. There's with vSphere, we pool our resources to provide a landing zone for virtual servers and virtual desktops. And the cloud is no different. There should be a pool of resources that is offered to your cloud users that can be consumed on demand. It should be elastic so that you can stretch out between 2 different data centers, or maybe different clusters within your data center, and that should be seamless to your user. And then we get down to more of the chargeback type ideals around measurable and standardized, so that when someone consumes your cloud, when they build virtual machines within this cloud construct, we should be able to measure that and understand what the cost impact is. And standardize, meaning we should understand that when someone deploys a virtual machine, that it gets done kind of the same way every time. They can pick from a catalog of virtual machines to deploy from. It should all be a very standard process. There shouldn't be one-off type efforts where you're having to code around unique cases. You should have a standard offering of virtual machines, and so on and so forth on that list. And the graphic is kind of showing that using things like scripts and programs and APIs is giving the cloud management layer the ability to programmatically do the things we're talking about in the phrases, so that we can build 300 virtual machines by calling one script, or perhaps a distributed workload, which is a workload that could exist on multiple servers, can automatically grow horizontally. So let's say you have 2 application servers and there's a demand that could be satisfied with a 3rd application server. We need to be able to leverage APIs in order to make that happen. We shouldn't have to ask a server admin to do that. And then there's 3 different ways that VMware kind of sees breaking up a data center to do different offerings. And they list it as the basic, committed, and dedicated virtual data centers. And they use terms such as pay-as-you-go and allocation pools and single tenants and things like that. And we'll go over that more, but it's basically the idea of offering resources at different allocation models. So that pay-as-you-go, for example, would be as you spin up a virtual machine, you pay only for what you use. Whereas allocation pool, you might be buying a dedicated amount of resources from your cloud, and it may be that you're charged whether or not you use it or not, and so on and so forth. The question also is, why is cloud important? You may not be using it at all in your environment or not really see the value of it, and I hope this course will help just realize that importance to you, or at the very least, you need to stay educated and focused on this, because like it or not, it is coming and it is going to permeate throughout the environments of small, medium, and large business. So I kind of break it up into 4 sections here, in that from the organizational perspective, they need a way to edge out their competition, or at the very least, stay in the game. So with the cloud, it's kind of one of those things, other people are going to learn to use it and drive out a competitive edge by using it. So therefore, it's going to become what I like to call table stakes, in that everyone's going to need to have some kind of play in the cloud in order to stay ahead of the game. Additionally, if you've worked in traditional IT for a while, you're probably used to the red tape and the departmentalization of IT, and frankly, the business units and even the C-level executives, maybe the CIO or the CEO, just feel that the deployment models are too slow. How fast can you spin up a virtual machine? It's usually 5 minutes, 10 minutes, however long it takes to clone the virtual machine. You have templates, and that's pretty easy stuff. But how long does it take to provision the rules in the firewall? How long does it take to set the IPs, in the environment? That you have to do a change control to acquire the IPs, or even configure the switch so that the right VLANs are exposed. Those are things that are slowing down the deployment models, and traditional IT just is not really equipped to handle those at scale. And I hinted on this a little earlier, but modern applications do have the ability to run in a distributed fashion. Now, legacy applications were not very distributed. They were very siloed. You would, for example, install a SQL server, you'd give it 16 gigs of RAM and 4 virtual CPUs, and that was it. If you needed to grow it, you either built a new server and migrated the databases, or you could give it, 8 vCPUs or 32 gigs of RAM, and then you'd adjust the software. But it was all very manual. It was a very planned process. It was something that required skilled individuals to really sit down and figure out what they were going to do, and then typically schedule an outage window or a maintenance window and do it. With more modern applications, with the way we're coding today, we can use the ability of the cloud's elasticity, where we can pay for what we need on demand to run distributed applications. Like I was saying before, if that application server is running on 2 virtual machines, all of a sudden a sale is being held by the company, and now you need 10 virtual machines worth of workload because thousands of new users are trying to hit your application. But that's where distributed workload comes in handy, where you have an application that can scale and programmatically build the 8 more virtual machines necessary and tie it all together without needing an administrator or an engineer to do that manually. And it would be difficult anyways to have a guy sitting there watching for that and saying, "Oh, Joe, I need 4 more virtual machines." And then, "Okay, Joe, the heat's down. You can get rid of 3 of them." It's not very feasible at scale. You might be able to do it for a couple applications, but if you're talking hundreds or thousands, you would need a lot of Joes to do that. And then The potential cost savings for highly scalable workloads. If you have dedicated hardware sitting on your floor in your data center to handle burstable or scalable workloads, that could translate into a lot of wasted dollars of equipment just sitting there depreciating that may not be used very fully. So in a lot of times, you can save money by having dedicated hardware on the floor if it's just going to be used all the time. But in a scalable workload, typically you can get better cost savings by going to a cloud infrastructure. And then I bring up career upkeep. And I mean, this is important no matter who you are or what you're doing, and that your career needs to evolve to a point where it's relevant at all times. If you're not relevant, then you have the potential to be rift, reduction in force, or possibly, outsourced or removed. There's all sorts of negative connotations with that. But either way, you're watching this video because you're interested in learning stuff. So you're on the right path. You have some kind of desire to understand more about vCloud. So I would imagine you're on the same page with career upkeep. And knowing how to build and maintain private and public clouds, it will be key as we move forward. It just will be a skill that even if you're not an expert at, you should have the knowledge necessary to talk intelligently about it. And really, as we begin to further converge infrastructure, as we begin to have less storage guys and network guys and server guys and more data center guys, branching out into other knowledge silos is just going to be required to remain competitive. Only the largest and most siloed environments are going to continue to need a storage guy or a backup guy. I'm not saying that those careers are going to go away. I mean, people have been saying that the tape drive was going to die for decades now, and it's still around. But what I'm saying is it's going to become more of a niche market to need those types of skill sets. Really, what people are going to need at the cloud level is someone that understands, at least at a basic level, all of the 4 food groups. And by that, I mean storage and server and network and hypervisor. Starting with vCloud is a good way to get your toe kind of dipped into the pool of all those different silos. So real quick, I brought up the definition from VMware on what a VMware vCloud is. This is important because it helps us understand kind of what VMware sees as the vision of vCloud so that you can kind of meet them in the middle with your definition. So they say the VMware solution for cloud computing that enables delivery of, and they italicize, infrastructure as a service. So if you've ever heard of the different as a services, there's PaaS and SaaS, platform as a service and software as a service. Those are nice, but they're not really what we're focusing on with VMware vCloud. We're trying to take the infrastructure that's provided by vSphere and further extrapolate that into infrastructure as a service by way of VMware vCloud. So it's kind of like that movie Inception where if you've seen it, they have a dream that they all go into, and then within that dream they dream again, and so on and so forth. And I use that example a lot in that we've got the physical hardware, and then we extrapolate that into logical constructs within vSphere, clusters and data centers and the like. And then we then extrapolate that even further into another logical construct called a vCloud, which is where we can take these vSphere resource pools and then present them, we can carve them up and present them into VMware vCloud resource groups. We'll go deeper into that, but that's kind of the model that we're going for here. Now, how does vCloud Director 5.1 fit into the stack? I've been talking about it, let's visualize it. So we'll start from the bottom. In the physical environment, you've got your storage, your physical servers, we call them hosts, the physical network, your switches and your routers and the like. And then the VLANs are kind of the logical way that we carve up those networks into virtual LAN or virtual local area networks. You then translate it up into vSphere environment, which should look pretty familiar, in that we've got, working from the right side, we've got storage is now translated to data stores. That's how we logically define our storage. The physical hosts are then translated to compute clusters. That's how we take, up to 32 hosts and logically kind of mash them together into a pool of resources. And they even talk about a resource pool, which is how we further logically define compute clusters into smaller groupings of resources. The physical network then becomes the DVS, a distributed virtual switch, although now it's the VDS, but I think they're just trying to show that it can be a virtual switch or a distributed virtual switch, as well as VLANs translate into distributed virtual switch port groups. So that's how we take physical and then extrapolate that into logical. You move up the stack another layer to the orange vCloud slice, and you start seeing a lot of mesh. You notice that there's less silo with the vCloud stack. It starts to blend in some of those items together. So on the right side, we have the provider virtual data center and the organization virtual data center. Notice that the provider virtual data center is a layer that feeds the organization virtual data center. So we take those compute resources, we take those data storage resources, and we translate that into what's called a PVDC, provider virtual data center. And then those are then the platform or the foundation that the organizations that live in vCloud use. They consume that. And on the left side, we take those networks and we start with provider networks, which are kind of the external networks that tie directly into those port groups, and network pools, which tie into the port groups as well, but they can be further divided into the organization networks and VApp networks. Now, I'll go ahead and definitely caution you that the networking piece in VMware vCloud is probably the most complex piece that you're going to deal with. So if you absolutely hate networking, this is probably going to be more challenging than if you find this stuff interesting. What I will tell you is that VMware has done a really good job at trying to take as much of the networking nitty-grittiness out of VMware vCloud, and that you're really not having to deal with any kind of line commands or understanding any of the features that a switch may need. It's really coming down to, we'll take the example of the provider, organization, and VApp network. The provider network, you need to provide networking to your vCloud that goes to the provider's network, the person that's providing the vSphere environment. The organization network is a network that is specifically given and assigned out to one of the organizations that's consuming your network. So any of the VApps within the organization could potentially use that to talk to one another. Then the VApp network is ways that the virtual machines within a VApp can talk to one another. So we're just taking kind of a broad view at the provider level and shrinking that at the organization level to make it more granular. And then even most granular is the VApp network. It's ways that we can slice these networks up to provide the services necessary to properly give networking resources to your consumer. So here's what you can expect from this course. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson. We'll go over the components of a vCloud so that you can better understand exactly how all these bits fit together. Now here's an example of the VMware vCloud suite. There's a lot of stuff going on here, and I'll break it down for you. So in the middle, I've got the VMware vCloud director box. It's in green, and it sits on top of all the cloud infrastructure pieces. Now below that is the VCNS, which is the vCloud networking and security piece, and the vCenter Site Recovery Manager, or VSRM. Now these components are told what to do by the vCloud Director server group. So the vCloud networking and security piece is told what to do, such as deploy a vShield Edge device or set some firewall rules, based on how they're logically grouped and defined at vCloud Director. And below that is the virtualization layer, because this is all being built on top of VMware vSphere. You know, like that old house reference where everyone says you need a good foundation to build a house. It's true, and in this case the foundation is VMware vSphere, and it's being told what to do by VMware vCloud Director. Now on the left you've got the management piece, and these are some products that serve different features that help you manage and maintain the vCloud infrastructure. So the first one's the vCloud Automation Center. This was formerly a product from Dynamic Ops. Now what vCloud Automation Center, or VCAC, or jokingly vCake as some call it, what that does is allows you to manage and offer a service request portal for not only a vCloud, but also other hypervisors clouds and even public clouds. The vCenter Operations Management Suite gives you the ability to do monitoring of physical and virtual machines, of configuration management. You can look at the relationship between your virtual machines. There's a whole host of products in there that help you really get capacity, monitoring, and control over your environment. vFabric Application Director is kind of similar in nature, but it's focused more on the applications that live within the virtual machines. Now on the right side, you've got the extensibility that feeds into this cloud suite. You've got things like APIs that can be called in order to execute things within your cloud so that you can use other products to tell your cloud what to do. You've got Cloud Connector, which allows you to import and export vApps into and out of your cloud. And you've got vCenter Orchestrator, which isn't necessarily tied directly to the cloud, but can talk to the vSphere layer and the cloud layer in order to make workflows to make processes that can be automated. The other big barrier in almost anything in IT is it has tons of acronyms. And you'll notice whenever people start talking about a product or a technology, it is just layered with acronyms. So in order to keep yourself caught up, you're just going to need to know these acronyms. So the first one's not an acronym, but it's the term cell. And a cell is really a simple way of saying the vCloud Director server. That's all it is. Now, within a vCloud Director server group, or in this case I call it an instance or a cluster to help you visualize it, all you're doing is you're taking multiple cells, you're logically combining them together, and that's your server group. So a cell translates into one vCloud Director server. The next is VCNS, and I've mentioned that prior, and it's the vCloud Network and Security Suite. It was formerly known as vShield. Then there's VCD, vCloud Director, and VDC, Virtual Data Center. And on top of VDC, you've got two other acronyms, PVDC and OVDC. PVDC is the Provider Virtual Data Center. This is where we've actually taken those hardware resources, those pools of compute and network and storage, and we've turned it into a provider level virtual data center, which is going to provide resources for the organization virtual data center. And we'll go over that in much more detail in further lessons. Now, I will caution you with these flags. VCD and VDC are incredibly easy to mix up. So you'll want to make sure that when you see VCD, you know it's vCloud Director, and when you see a VDC, it's a virtual data center. And really, DC is kind of baked into my brain as that's the data center. So let's go further into what I was talking about with cells and look at a picture of how the scalable architecture within vCloud Director works. So let's divide this mentally into the top half and the bottom half. The top half of the graphic shows how a vCloud Director server group works. In this particular case, there are 4 vCloud Director servers, or cells, that come together to make a logical vCloud Director server group. Now, the important thing to notice with this graphic is how many vCloud Director databases do you see? Just one. It doesn't matter that you have 4 cells, they're all talking to the same database. They all provide the same services. There'll be a load balancer on front of it, most likely, that will get you to various vCloud Director servers. But think of these just kind of like web servers or application servers in a 3-tier stack model. All they're doing is providing a way to get into the vCloud environment. Now on the bottom half, you've got a little bit different architecture. This is your standard vSphere environment. And notice in this graphic, you've got 3 vCenters all talking to the same vCloud Director server group. That's possible, and there's no issues with that. But each vCenter has its own ESX or ESXi hosts, and in this case, we're talking just ESXi 5 because we're using 5 in this lesson. And each vCenter talks to its own database and its own vShield manager. Now notice, we've been saying VCNS or vCloud Networking Security over and over, but you'll still see these references to vShield here and there. That's why I'll continue to reinforce that so you don't get confused. So the takeaway here is each vCenter is its own database, its own vShield manager, and has its own hosts, but can talk to a single vCloud Director server group. Now let's talk about the design of how you're going to put your clusters together. In the words of VMware, and in my recommendation, and what I see in the real world, is you'll have 2 types of clusters. The first one is the management cluster. This is what I consider to host the brains of a vCloud. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, this is where you're going to put all those really important virtual machines that run the cloud. So this may be your traditional server environment that you're managing now, your standard vSphere server environment. You're going to put virtual machines in here just like you would normally. That would be your vCloud Director cells, your vShield Manager server, and so on. And what this does is it has a couple different benefits, and I list most of them here, but a big one is that separation of duty item. And what that enables you to do is you can have vSphere administrators that just know vSphere, and they don't have to know vCloud because you're not mixing the 2 environments. To them, it's just a virtual machine that's running inside of their vSphere environment, and that's a positive thing. And I say that because in the next item, many actions should not ever be performed in a vCloud environment. You do not want to do certain things in vSphere because it would be detrimental to vCloud. An example that I give is disabling vSphere DRS, because one of the constructs that vCloud Director relies upon heavily is the use of resource pools. And if you destroy vSphere DRS by disabling it, guess what goes bye-bye? All those resource pools. And that's bad. That's going to basically wreck your environment, and you're going to have to call support, and they'll put the pieces back together for you. It also makes troubleshooting easier because you don't have management of the vCloud also living within stuff that's being managed by the vCloud. And I like to use this tired example of the Inception model. It was this movie where basically the main characters would have a dream, and they would appear in that dream, and then from that dream they dream again, and so on and so forth. And it becomes quite complex when you're managing something that is also providing you resources. So we typically want to build a management cluster, and that should be part of your architecture. So the second type of cluster is a resource group or resource cluster, and they consist of pools of resources that the vCloud Director manages. So this is how you're going to provide resources to your consumers or to your clients or to your departments. And the graphic tries to show this in that we've got two different clusters shown here. The top one is the management cluster. And notice at the very top layer, you've got two vCenters, one for resources, one for management. The management vCenter manages the management cluster, so it's used only for that. And the resource vCenter is managing the resource clusters. So we've got some separation of duty there. You also have some of those virtual machines I was talking about, the VCD, and notice there's two because we want some high availability on our VCD. You've got the database server that vCloud is talking to, and you've got the vShield Manager, VSM, which is now VCNS, and all those items are living in the management cluster. Then at the bottom in the resource cluster, all you have is a combination of different virtual machines that your cloud consumers have built. So that's the model we're trying to build here. It keeps things nice and clean and makes it easy for you. So let's do a quick live lab walkthrough and show you kind of how I built things to get you started on it so you understand kind of what it's going to look like. All right, so this is my home lab, and I'll have a lesson coming up that'll show you kind of how to build your home lab. But in this case, I have a management cluster called Lab, and I'm going to minimize this little guy here. The Lab cluster has 3 hosts in it, and this is where I'm also going to locate, I'll switch over real quick, my vCloud Director virtual machines. Now I've gone ahead and built them just to show you kind of what it would look like here, but we will be building these out in future lessons. And you'll see here, here's a vCloud Director appliance that I put in for the lab. Here's my Cloud vCenter, and here's the vShield Manager. So with these 3 virtual machines, we can get started in a lab environment, which I've got over here. So here is the private cloud. And this one looks a little more fancy. I've got a data center named Chicago. I've got a vCloud cluster here with 2 hosts. Got some resource pools. This is kind of an end state look, but this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about a management cluster and resource clusters. These 2 clusters can't see each other. They're not tied together in any way. And that makes troubleshooting and management much easier. So it's also important to understand what's new in vCloud Director 5.1. And I've kind of highlighted some of the really neat things that people were looking forward to. I've actually flagged one of them. We'll go over that. But the kind of no-brainer is there's support for vSphere 5.1. Makes sense because the product is called 5.1. And subsequently, virtual hardware version 9, which was introduced with vSphere 5.1 and gives you those monster VMs, where it can run 64 cores and a terabyte of memory and some crazy amounts of resources. The really cool thing about 5.1 is it now offers storage profiles. So if you've never worked with vCloud Director prior to this, managing storage and showing storage to your consumers was quite tedious in the past, in that you couldn't offer different tiers of storage in the same PVDC, provider virtual data center. You had to kind of split them off into a gold PVDC and a silver PVDC and a bronze PVDC, and they may have different types of storage underneath. So now we can offer storage profiles so that within a PVDC we can offer flash disks or nearline SAS or SATA disks or whatever it is you have. So that's really cool. There's also a new organizational VDC network model, and I'll go over that in detail later, but let's just say it makes life a lot easier when you're doing your network pools. We've also got elastic VDCs available for the allocation pool model. And this just basically means when you're doing an allocation pool, which means that we're going to allocate a certain amount of resources for our VDC, we can make it elastic across different vCenters. Additionally, we now have a supported use of vSphere snapshots. Now, I know some people would go into the vSphere view and just do a snapshot. That was not actually supported prior to 5.1. Now, directly through the GUI, you can do snapshots of your vApps and virtual machines. There's also support for single sign-on, which was new with vSphere 5.1. And the VCNS has some new gateway services, or improved gateway services in some cases, in that it offers a pretty good load balancer, a VPN tied to another one, a NATing, DHCP, and a pretty good firewall. The last thing I want to leave you with is there's a great resource that I want to point you to. It's called the VMware vCloud Architecture Toolkit, or VCAT. So you can visit vmware.com/go/vcat, and you register to make sure that you can get in there. There's a one-time they just want to see who's getting in there. But this has a crazy amount of documents, and I really rely on this thing for my day-to-day use of vCloud because I can't keep all of it in my brain. It's pretty impossible to be a human dictionary unless you were to do this all day long every day. And so they break kind of the design of a vCloud and the definitions of how vCloud should be built into requirements, considerations, examples, and then they have some advanced topics on how to build workflows and tools and how to burst and things like that. Definitely recommend if you get some time, go visit it, register, and then bookmark it so that you have it for future use. That does it for this lesson, and I'll see you in the next one. In this lesson, we're going to go over why you'd want to build a vCloud lab, and then some ways to build a vCloud lab. It's important to understand the why because it's not necessarily difficult to build one, but you have to have some reasons why you'd want to go through the process of building a vCloud lab. After all, it's not necessarily easy. It takes some effort, takes some money. It's an investment in you and your future. So what's the reason you'd want to build a vCloud lab? I would advise it because it's a great way to reinforce the learning that you're doing here with these lessons. You're hearing and seeing ways to leverage vCloud Director, but having the ability to do as well, to have a live environment where you can really practice what you're learning, reinforces that knowledge. It's going to boost your retention and give you more practical skills that you can then reproduce in the workplace. Additionally, sometimes breaking things and doing them the wrong way first gives you the best way forward to do it the right way. I know I've managed to install stuff incorrectly or misinterpret instructions multiple times. It's just normal. I think we all do. And having a lab gives you the ability to break things. And it's not in production, so no one knows. So it's a safe environment where if you do cause things to explode, no one's the wiser. Additionally, a lab gives you the ability to explore specific features, or maybe you have a design in mind that's very specific. You want to try this specific application. You can then do that in your lab and see exactly how it's going to react in a real environment. I'll also comment that if you go on the internet and you look up how to build a lab, you're going to get ridiculous amounts of results. Everyone has a different opinion on exactly how you build a lab. And it can get kind of personal. There's a lot of opinions, we'll say, where people defend what's a good lab, what's a bad lab. And even I've contributed to those different discussions through various posts and such. So we'll put it this way. In my opinion, a good lab is one that solves the problems that you have and fulfills your goals. If your goal is just to play with vCloud Director, then the lab should reflect that. If you need a full-on featured lab with all sorts of hardware and blinking lights and network gear, then that's your goal and you need that kind of lab. What I build in my lab will not necessarily work for you, and there is no right or wrong way. There is no only way. There's just the way that works. So let's talk about that for a bit. There's kind of 3 different types of labs that I see. These different ways of building your lab kind of start at the cheap and easy and move all the way to the large and expensive. The first one, a VMware workstation. That's where you buy VMware's product called VMware Workstation, and you install it on your physical desktop, maybe your laptop, and you use that to virtualize workloads. And this is nice because you really don't have to buy any hardware. You already own a desktop or a laptop, I would hope. All you're doing is buying a piece of software. What you might need to do is invest in some more memory. Typically, I advise no less than 8 gigabytes of memory for your desktop or laptop.
And especially in a laptop, you're probably going to need to upgrade to a solid-state drive. Laptops more commonly ship with a slower 5400 RPM SATA drive, which is really not going to perform at the level that you're going to expect when you're running 3 or more virtual machines. One other nice thing about having VMware Workstation as your lab is that it's on demand. You turn it on when you need it, you turn it off when you don't. Moving up from that, another option is to buy a physical server and run esxi on it. This would be a dedicated piece of hardware that you use specifically for your lab. Now, the nice thing here is you can really adjust how you want to build this server to make it really good for your lab. And by that I mean, maybe you want a ton of memory in your lab. You want this box to have 32 gigs of RAM, and maybe that's not possible in your laptop. So you could do that with a dedicated physical box. And in the grand scheme of things, buying one server is really not that expensive. You also avoid really the need to have a bunch of networking gear, because one physical server with virtual machines on it can talk inside of itself. The VMs can talk to each other. Or if you want to use different VLANs, you could potentially install a virtual machine that does the routing for you. Now, the last tier of your own lab is what I call a server farm. And really by that I just mean it has 2 or more physical servers. This is the most expensive way to go, but it's also the most realistic because you're going to need networking gear and a storage array and so on. You're going to need a more realistic environment where there's challenges in that. It becomes more difficult to do the networking piece and provide the layer 2 and layer 3 networking configuration. You're going to have to set up a storage array. You're going to have to design around those items. But it is more realistic. You'd have to overcome those challenges in most enterprise environments too. One thing I will caution, because I have a home lab, it's sitting in my home office, and I had to go through some similar things, is make sure to talk to the people who live in your house, your family, and if you have kids, this may be a special consideration too, that it takes up a certain amount of size, it's a little noisy, it produces heat and takes up power, and we want to make sure that everyone's on board of what is this thing that's running in the corner and making all this noise. Make sure the kids don't think it's a Lego set and they try to disassemble it for you. So just be courteous and make sure everyone's on board, they know what it is, and express the value. This is how you're going to learn for your career, maybe for certifications, and it's going to be an investment in you. And I find that typically works well. It has a good message. So let's move on to the vCloud Director appliance. The vCloud Director appliance is a packaged virtual appliance that VMware provides for you to evaluate vCloud Director. It's not meant for production. And in fact, if you install it for a production workload, support's going to kind of thumb the nose at you and say, this is really not the way you should be doing it. But it is an easy way to get started with vCloud Director. Now, I'll pause for a moment and say, this isn't a shortcut to working with vCloud Director. You still need to know exactly how to install vCloud Director on a Red Hat server. So you'll need to know how to install it the normal way. You'll need to know how to configure the database and all that good stuff. Those are important skills to have. But with that said, the appliance is a good way after you've mastered those skills, or if you're doing it in your VMware Workstation lab where you have a very limited amount of memory and room for virtual machines, this thing is a great way to get started with vCloud. I'll walk you through exactly how you get the product evaluation so that you can download the OVA, which is the Open Virtualization Appliance, that will be deployed into your lab. Okay, so now we're on the VMware website, and all I've done is gone to vmware.com, then I went to the product section and chose vCloud Director. And this is the page that you'll roughly be greeted with. It may change between now and then, but this is what you're going to see. And in the bottom left corner, you'll find the Download Free Trial button. So click that. And I've already gone ahead and logged into the website just to avoid having to show you my super secret account information on video. But in this area where it says Welcome Chris W., it would have an area saying you want to log in with a current account or make a new account. If you don't have one, go ahead and make a new account. And if you have one, go ahead and log in. At that point, you'll be asked to agree to the licensing necessary to evaluate vCloud Director. And you'll get 60 days to do so. I've gone ahead and started that evaluation. Obviously, I've been working with the product for the videos, and I have 34 days out of the 60 remaining. Now, when I scroll down here a little bit,
I'm in the license and download tab. There's all these different tabs right here. This is really what we're interested in, is downloading the files necessary. So first you've got the licenses for both vCloud Director and the vCloud Network and Security, which was formerly vShield, available to you. So if you can't remember what they are, or you lose the email or whatever, they're always going to be right here ready to go. These evaluation keys will expire on a very specific date, 60 days after you start the evaluation, and it's listed right here. For me, April 10th, these keys will become garbage. If you scroll down a little more, you see the download packages that are available, or the packages that you can download. And there's two that we're interested in, being the VMware vCloud Director 5.1.1 OVA file. This is going to be the open virtualization format appliance that we're going to grab that'll have all the vCloud Director goodies baked into it. So we'll want to start downloading that. I'm going to click manually download because I don't want to mess around with a download manager on this virtual machine. So we're just going to do it the old school way, manual download. I'm going to save the file. And then you'll probably want to go ahead and grab the vCloud and Network and Security Manager right here. This is also an OVA that you can grab, and you can click manually download, and that will be downloaded to your machine so that you can deploy it into the vSphere environment. So I'll go ahead and click that, manual download, we'll save it. We'll go ahead and save that one too. So you're looking at roughly 1.3, it's right here, 1.4 gigabytes of data for the vCloud Director OVA, and 1.3 gigabytes of data for the vCloud Network and Security OVA. So it may take you a while depending on your internet connection. But fortunately, I have the magic voodoo of video, and I can skip all the way to the end where we've got the files downloaded. All right, so we've skipped ahead, and I've downloaded the two files. And here they are on my desktop, the vShield Manager OVA and the vCloud Director OVA. Now, we're just focusing on the vCloud Director in this lesson, but it's good that you went ahead and downloaded vShield for later. So now let's go into the vSphere client, and I'll show you how to actually make use of this vCloud Director OVA file. So here I've got the vSphere client into my management cluster. It's called Lab, inside the data center called Home Lab. And I've made a folder called Demo just so we can watch the process of installing this particular OVA. Now to start with, you'll go to the File menu up here, and you'll choose Deploy OVF Template. You might be thinking, wait a minute, I thought this was an OVA. Where's that button? Well, there is no button that specifically says OVA. It says OVF, which is the Open Virtualization File format. It's going to work interchangeably in this event. So you browse, it's on my desktop, here's the file. This is what it's going to look like roughly. The build number right here might change a little bit. It's basically just saying this is the version 5.1.1.0. This is the specific build, and that it's an OVA file. If you don't see the file for some reason, make sure that the file type has OVA listed. I know there's some imports where it chooses between OVF and OVA, so just make sure that shows up. Click Open, and Next. Now it's going to give you some information about the file that you're trying to import. It says it's vCloud Director, which we kind of assume that. It's version 5.1.1.0, which was in the file name, so that checks out. And the download size of 1.3 gigs is what I had to download. So that all checks out. The question then becomes size on disk, 2.3 gigs for thin provision or 30 gigs for thick provision. Now, you should have a good idea what these different terms mean from your vSphere background, but we'll go over it really quick. In that 2.3 gigs thin provision means we're going to thinly provision that file on our storage, which basically equates to it's a 30 gig disk from a provisioning standpoint, but we're only going to write 2.3 gigs of data to the array. Potentially, this is very handy in a lab environment because disk is kind of a premium for me. I don't have a whole ton of disk laying around in my lab, and I would imagine you probably don't either. So I typically go thin for the lab. 30 gig thick provision means that we're going to reserve and allocate all that space right up front, all 30 gig. No one else can touch it or use it. This may be good when you're actually doing it on your storage array at work for a proof of concept or a test. But again, in the lab, it just eats up a lot of disk. So we're going to use thin. Make sure to read all of the licensing agreement. I'm going to speed read it really quick. And good. Okay, I agree to that. I'm going to click accept and next. And now we get to name the virtual machine. Just to make it easier on my noodle, I'm going to call it the vCloud Director Appliance. And that way I know this is the appliance virtual machine. And because I started, you see I've got demo selected when we did the import.
it automatically chose demo as the folder for the destination. If you didn't choose a folder on the beginning and it's going to put it in the root or some weird folder, that's okay. We can move it later. Now we got to choose which host or cluster to put it on. I have DRS running, vSphere DRS, Distributed Resource Scheduler, so I don't get to choose a host so much as just the cluster that I want to put it on. And I'm going to put it on the cluster called Lab, which is my management cluster. And then again, we get to choose a resource pool, which you should have a little bit of background on this from the vSphere side, but it's basically a way that we can carve up the physical resources into a pool of logical resources. So a common implementation of this would be resource pools to divide different types of workloads. Maybe you have production and non-production, or database and web, things like that. I don't have any resource pools in my lab. All I have is a VApp for VCOps, which we can ignore. So I'm just going to click on my lab. And in your lab, it's probably going to be the same. We really don't need a resource pool. Now we need to pick where to put the virtual machine. I have 4 different data stores available to me, and they have kind of naming that describes what they do. This one is for my ISOs. This one is for my management cluster, which you don't see here. And this one is for my virtual machines. So we want to use the one for virtual machines. Really quick, if I look, it has 430 gigabytes of free space, which is perfect because this virtual machine uses 2.3 gigabytes of space out of the box with a thin provision, and up to 30 gigs of space if it's fully thick provisioned. It's also NFS, which will come in play with the next screen. So we'll choose this data store, click next, and then again I said it's NFS, so thin provision is automatically selected, and there's no way to change the choice. It's all grayed out. That's because by default, NFS can only thin provision. VMFS, I would have the choice of thick provision, either lazy or eager zeroed. But because it's NFS, I can only thin provision. The only way around that is if your storage array vendor had a plugin that would let you thick provision on NFS. So for the sake of this demo, we'll just do thin provision and leave it there. And make sure, again, that the free space here exceeds the amount of the virtual machine. So because I'm thin provisioning, I need about 2.5 gig. I've got 430. That checks out. We can move on. Now we get to the networking, and now we're starting to get into a little bit of the knowledge around how vCloud Director works. So vCloud Director, and it has a pretty good description here, it's telling you that one network is going to be for the UI, which is the HTTP, and the other one is going to be used for console access to the virtual machines inside the vCloud. There's also a warning saying that the multiple source networks are mapped to the same host network. This is just telling me that here I've got both networks mapped to the same port group. And this is the default one. I don't want to actually put it on this one. I'm going to put it on, in my lab, my virtual machine port group. This is a port group dedicated to virtual machines in my management cluster. The 1 just denotes that that's the VLAN it's on. VLAN 1, the name is VMs. So I'll put that one there. And now watch, the warning goes away, and when I put this one on VM1, the warning comes back because the port groups are the same. We'll go into the networking piece a lot more in depth in the next lesson, but let's just say this for now. In a lab environment, there's nothing wrong with having them on the same port group and the same VLAN. If we're doing this in a more realistic environment, you would probably want to put them on different VLANs. This gives you isolation of the VLANs and security in that we don't have traffic from one VLAN potentially talking to the other VLAN. It isolates those 2 networks off, and that also feeds into security. I can't necessarily hijack the console port and get access to the HTTP port. Now finally, we got to answer a lot of questions around the actual configuration of the virtual machine. The first question is, what database do you want to use for vCloud Director? Now in a normal production install, we have to provide one. We have to provide either Oracle or SQL as an external virtual machine. The nice thing about the vCloud Director appliance is we have a choice of internal. There's a little Oracle database baked into it that we can just use. So that's great. If you don't want to use it, I'm not exactly sure why, because you're going through the process of using the appliance, might as well use the internal database. You can choose external Oracle or SQL. We're going to use internal. Because we're using internal, a lot of these questions, it says skip to the networking properties section if you chose internal. We're going to do exactly that. We're going to skip all this stuff and go right to networking properties. That's kind of cool. You get to skip all those questions around the database. So you'll notice right here it says leave blank if DHCP is desired. That's the dynamic way of assigning IPs in an environment. Now, it's not very common to see DHCP for a server virtual machine. I just don't see it very often. When I do see it, it may be with reservations set up so this virtual machine always gets the same IP. But what better way to guarantee that this VM always gets the same IP than to just hard code it in there? And that's the way I do it, and that's the way I typically see it done in the real world, where we have a name server with a specific name that matches a specific set of IPs, and that's set in stone. We really don't ever want to change that. And that's the way I would recommend doing it. So we're going to do the same thing here. So I'm going to put in my IP information for the default gateway. I'm going to put in my DNS address. And I'm just putting in the IPs here. If I had another one, I only have one, but if I had another one, you put a comma, and then I could put another address here, if that existed. It doesn't for me, but I just want to show you how to do it. And then we need a pair of IPs. Let me drag it down here a little bit. The description's pretty handy. It's telling you that you're going to put two IPs, one for IP address network 1, one for the network 2 IP address. The lower address is going to be used for the HTTP access, for the user interface. It's telling you right here, user interface API access to vCloud. The higher address will be used for console access. So just to make it easy on myself, I always put the lower address in the beginning, in the network 1 IP address, and I put the higher one in network 2. That way I know where they are. Just in my mind, that makes things easier. So we're going to use 10.0.0.91 here with a Class C subnet mask, 3255s and a 0. And we're going to use 10.0.0.92 here with the same subnet mask. So just because I put it in that way, the lower IP is .91. We know that's going to be used for the user interface. And the second IP is .92, and we know that'll be used for console access. Plus, it kind of makes it easier. I like it when it ends with a 1 right here. Network 1, 91, network 2, 92. To me, that just helps my brain understand which IP is which. Just makes it work for me. And then the final screen shows you the deployment task and the configuration that you set. So you can walk through. It should match pretty much this list on the left will be matched with answers here on the right. And that we know it's going to be about 2.3 gig, and we made sure we had space for that. There's the name that it was given and where it's going to live on demo in the lab cluster, which is my management cluster. On my VMs data store with a thin provisioning, here's the network VM1. And then all the answers to the questions right here. It's an internal database, so it just skips on down to here. We've got the gateway address, the DNS, and the 2 IPs. I typically don't power on after deployment just because I want to make sure everything looks good after deployed. So I'm going to click Finish. I'm going to let it start deploying. And I think we'll probably, with the magic of video, skip through this and come back to when it's deployed. All right, so it has deployed successfully. Congratulations. A big applaud all around. And we'll click Close. And there it is. Here's your new vCloud Director Virtual Machine. It's the appliance. You'll notice it's running SUSE Linux, which is different from Red Hat Linux that we would deploy for a production environment. And 5.1.1.0 shows up as the version, so it's very easy to tell exactly what version and build you're running right here. You'll also notice that it uses 1 vCPU and about 2.5 gigs of RAM, which is fine. And it'll say VMware Tools is third-party independent. That's important. It means that the tools that were installed are specific to this virtual machine. So I would advise don't play with that. Don't try to overwrite the tools with the most latest and greatest ones. Just let it be the third-party independent mode. And it's not running because it's not powered on. And on the right, you'll see the resources consumed are 2.3 gigs of storage. So that's fine. We expected that. That's what the wizard told us. And provision storage is 32.69 gig. You might wonder if you were paying attention very carefully that it said 30 gig for thick provisioning, but here it says 32.69 gig. What's the difference? That's the swap file for the memory. Now see here, the memory is about 2.5 gigs, and that's about 2.5 gigs over the 30, so that's where the difference is. Additionally, it's on the VM1 network and the VM storage. So everything looks good. I like it. If you needed for some reason to tweak this virtual machine, you could do so now and give it more memory or maybe steal a little bit of memory. I found that the config that it comes in with the 1 CPU and the 2.5 gigs of RAM is pretty much perfect. So we're going to go ahead and power this on. Now, while it's doing the power on option, I'll just show you a little preview of what's going on behind the scenes. If I open the console to the virtual machine, we'll see that it automatically starts configuring itself and installing, what it needs to do on the database and setting up the daemons and all that good stuff. It's pretty cool to watch it go through and completely configure itself. So there's those IPs that I gave it, 91 and 92. It's all being configured for the network. Setting up SSL certificates. And it'll go through and actually bake the database too. So we're not going to watch this whole thing because it takes probably about 10 minutes the first time, but just an idea of what it should look like when it powers on. And again, because it is the first time it's booted up, it's got to do a configuration. It will take a little while to get started. All right, so now you've seen how to acquire and deploy the vCloud Director appliance. Let's go into the final piece of building your vCloud lab. And that's the licenses. Because obviously you could download this software all day long and it doesn't do anything if it's not licensed. Or at least it won't fill the needs that we need to be on the free license. One of the requirements to do vCloud Director is we're going to need full Enterprise Plus level licensing for the vCloud environment. We need distributed switches and DRS. And distributed switches are specifically only available with Enterprise Plus licensing. So what I'd recommend is go ahead back to that VMware website, grab 60-day trials of all the stuff you see here. vCenter Server, esxi, vCloud Director, and the vCloud Network and Security, formerly vShield Manager. You're going to need 60-day trial of all this stuff. Here's some tips. First, gather all the licenses at the same time. Don't piecemeal it around. That way, everything's at 60 days. You're not, 30 days in and all of a sudden your vSphere environment, dies on you because the licensing's gone. And then 20 days later, your vCloud environment dies on you because the licensing's gone. Just grab it all at the same time and use the same email address. Just have one email address that you use for all 4 of these licenses. And that way, if you have to go in there and re-download some software or get the key again, you just put in that one email address. You don't have to remember 2 or 3 or whatever. And last, I advise making calendar reminders or events in your calendar to let you know where you're at on the milestone. So typically what I'll do, as soon as I download a trial, I know it's 60 days out, so I'll make a calendar event for 60 days out that says this is when the evaluation is going to expire. And that way I can set reminders, maybe 2 weeks prior, 1 week prior, 1 day prior, whatever makes sense. And that way I know this is how much time left I have with the environment to learn what I'm trying to learn. So if you're going for a certification or you're trying to look to do some learning for a real deployment, this is kind of the drop dead date that I have to get that learning completed before my lab, goes south on me. So that's a tip that just makes it easier so that you're not surprised by the fact that the lab has died on you. In addition to that, in the bottom right corner of the vSphere client, and if you're in the web client, I believe it's at the top of the web page, it's going to tell you a countdown when you get close to the end saying your licenses are about to expire. So there's a couple different ways you can be warned of it, but you just don't want to be surprised. That completes the vCloud Director Lab lesson, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Now, this lesson's going to be pretty detailed. I mean, you'll really have to hold on tight because we're going to go very technical and very deep into everything you need to do to install vCloud Director. That includes the database, the Red Hat Enterprise Linux server, the SSL certificates, and actually installing the vCloud Director software. Let's begin at the beginning, which is the planning and the design, because you don't want to just plow headfirst into this thing. It's kind of a beast. Once you've done it a couple times, you'll think, oh man, I can't believe I ever thought that was hard. But I know the first time I did it, I thought it was pretty intimidating. So the best way to start is to go over what you'll need ahead of time. What software do you need to download? What IPs do you need to set? All that good stuff. So I'm going to give you kind of the shopping mall version of the you are here. And that here's the lab design and what we're trying to build in this vCloud Director course. Now, right now, the arrow's pointing towards the VCD cells, the vCloud Director server itself, because that's all we're doing in this lesson. The rest of it will be covered in different lessons, but this is where you are right now. In the planning and design phase of vCloud Director, we need to do a little bit of homework. Nobody likes homework, right? But it's important because without this information and without having done this work ahead of time,
you're going to be in for a lot of frustration. So let's just get it done now and get it out of the way. For the object identities, basically I'm just saying we need to go out and create kind of some personality for the server before we go and install it. And we need to figure out what IP addresses we'll be using for the vCloud Director server. We need one for the web service or HTTP service, but it's hard to say HTTP, so I like to say web service. The other one's for the console proxy service. And basically the web service is what we connect to when we open our browser, and the console proxy service is what we connect to when we want to open up the console for a virtual machine. We'll also want to go ahead and make DNS-A records for both those IPs. And that's just the relationship of this name goes to this IP. And finally, we'll need to determine what the logical name of the VMs need to be. In this lesson, it really just boils down to what are we going to call the virtual machine that's running vCloud Director. Sometimes it's the same as the DNS name, and other times it's different. It's your choice. There's also some requirements that we'll need to meet ahead of time in order to really smooth out this install. The first is the vCloud Director 5.1.1 install bin file. That's kind of like, yeah, of course, if you're installing vCloud, you'll need the installation file. So I think no one's surprised by that one. The other one is we'll need a server running Red Hat Enterprise Linux, version 5 or 6. I'll be using version 6.2, which is basically RHEL 6 update 2. That's how you translate the 6.2. We'll also need to grab a file called libxdmcp. It's an RPM package. Basically, this is something that vCloud Director is going to need to operate that Red Hat Enterprise Linux doesn't come with out of the box. And I've got one of those nice little short URLs you can use to go grab that. And finally, we'll need a database. It has to be compatible with vCloud Director, so you're limited to SQL or Oracle. And out in the field, I pretty much see SQL all over the place. So guess what? I'll be using SQL in this demonstration. If you want to look at the complete list of all the databases you could possibly use, there's a link for that on this slide that you can go to. But for this lesson, I will be using my SQL Server in the lab, which is running Microsoft SQL 2008 R2 Enterprise. Do you need Enterprise to do vCloud Director? Absolutely not. I run it in the lab because I'm into overkill. I just go with the biggest version there was. But you could run 2008 R2 Express, which is completely free, and that's fine. So since I was talking about the database, let's start with configuring the database. Now, a lot of times, this is kind of the more creepy part of the install for most server admins, because I'm not a DBA, a database admin. I don't really spend a lot of time in databases. I know enough to get by, and probably you do too, because you've had to work with databases for vCenter and Update Manager and things like that. So let's go over the basics of what you need to do to configure the database for vCloud Director. Now notice we're doing that before we've ever actually even installed Red Hat or the vCloud Director software. We're doing this very far in advance to get it done. Fortunately, VMware provides some really handy installation scripts, and you can run these scripts to do all the heavy lifting. So you can be like, oh man, look, I installed this SQL database, I'm awesome. And your friends will be like, how did he do that? And in the back, behind closed doors, you just ran a script that someone else gave you. So that's awesome. That's like IT in a nutshell. The script's going to do 4 things. It's basically going to make the database, do a little bit of housekeeping in the form of some transaction isolation levels and things like that. It's going to make a database user account so that it can control the database. And it's going to assign permissions to the user account, which basically means it's going to make it the owner of the database. That's it. I will note, if you're not into SQL and you don't know what your mode is, you need to use SQL Mixed Mode Authentication. There's 2 modes that SQL can be in: Windows Authentication and Mixed Mode Authentication. We need to make sure it's in mixed mode because otherwise we can't use native SQL accounts. We'd have to use Windows accounts, which is a no-go for vCloud. It needs a native SQL account. So I've opened a remote desktop session to my SQL server, which, if you notice at the top, very creatively named SQL. That's right, I like to keep my lab very easy, and it's almost impossible to forget the name of a SQL server called SQL. So let's dive right into the tool we'll be using on the SQL server to do the database work. If you click Start, Programs, Microsoft SQL, whatever flavor you have, you should have installed or have installed
the Management Studio software somewhere on your server. It's either on your desktop, maybe it's on the server. I have mine on the server. Make sure that you have those tools somewhere readily available. Now my account, this Chris account, is full, crazy level admin on everything. So I'm using that to connect. And I'm using a period here for the server name, which means the server that I'm on. If you're connecting from your desktop, you'll need to actually type in the server name. And because the server name is SQL, you kind of think, man, how lazy is this guy if he types a period to save 2 letters? But, that's how I roll. So now I've got the Management Studio open. I'll pull up the script that VMware provides, and we'll go over how exactly it works. So first, let me switch over to the website on VMware so you can see how to get the script. Okay, so I'm on VMware's website, and all I did was I went to the support section, which opens up this big box, and I clicked vCloud Director. And once you do that, it's going to give you a list of all these different support files that you can look at. Now this is important because you really need to know how to get here on your own. You can't always remember a link. So the first one right here, vCloud Director Install and Upgrade Guide. That's your pot of gold right there. Click on HTML version, and it'll load this page right here. Now it won't come directly to this page, this actual piece, but it'll come to the main root. And all I did was I navigated down this little tree to how to configure Microsoft SQL Server Database. If you want to cheat, you could just type SQL Server in the search bar, and it'll show you this link. But now you know exactly how to walk your way to this page and kind of to all these directions if you ever need to. So kind of that whole teach a man to fish, he'll never go hungry. I've now fed you for the rest of your life. You're welcome. Okay, so it's telling you how to do the SQL Server Database. That's great. This is kind of stuff, blah, blah, blah. And there's the scripts. There's actually 4 of them. They're all very small. And they all start with this. You see how the text is kind of a different font? And all it starts with the word use. Man, my highlighting's killing me here. There we go. Starts with use, and it ends with go. So that's the first script. And then here's the second script. Again, use to go. The third one, use to go. And okay, guess what? The fourth one, use to go. So you grab all 4 of those and copy them, and we'll switch over to SQL real quick, and I'll show you the script that I made that contains those 4 mini scripts. Okay, so we're back on the SQL server, and I'll open a file that I generated called vCloud Query. I put it on my desktop, and it's just a paste of all those different scripts that you saw in there. That's all it is. I just copy and pasted it on over. Nothing that difficult. Now, I did make 2 changes, and you might be able to spot it. Now, the cool thing about working with a query in SQL Management Studio is it color codes all this stuff. It makes it really easy to read. What I did was I changed the file paths. Now, it's not cool enough to wrap this around, so I'll scoot over to the right a little bit. But the default file path was vcloud.mdf. Well, that's not going to work. I don't want my database running on the C drive. And most database servers don't run their database files on the C drive. Mine runs on the E drive, specifically this long path. How did I find that? Did it the old school way. Went to my E drive here, and you just have to know where it's at. It's in Program Files, Microsoft SQL Server, Microsoft SQL, blah, blah, blah here, Microsoft SQL, and then Data. Make sure you memorize that. It's tested later. No, I'm kidding. So here we go. Here's all the data files for SQL. I just grabbed the URL up here, or the link rather, copied it, and then pasted it right into here. And there we go. Make sure there's a slash there. So I'm just telling it that's the path. So let's go over the script and show how it works. So the first part's just saying, hey, use the master database and create a new database called vCloud. The first name is telling it where to put the database itself. I'll scroll over again. So that MDF is the database file. And the second file is the log file, basically the transaction logs. And there's a size limited to it. So 100 megs, grow at 10%, 1 meg, grow at 10%. So it's pretty small. That's all that first section is doing. It's just creating the database, telling where the files go, and telling it to use, this is basically saying do it in English. Nothing that fancy. Let's look at the next script. It's saying use the new vCloud database and alter it in 4 different ways. So it's doing a little housekeeping there. All right, nothing too fancy there. The third script is telling you
that it's going to use that vCloud database again, and it's going to make a user called vCloud. That might be a little confusing. You got a database called vCloud, you got a user called vCloud, but we're making the user called vCloud with a password of very secret. That's the password that I gave to it. Now, don't use a password that simple, but I'm going to get away with it in this demonstration and for this lab. So it's saying the default database for the vCloud user is the vCloud database, and it's an English-speaking user. And the check policy is saying don't check the password policy for it. Creates the user, and there we go. That's the third script. The fourth script says, go ahead and make that vCloud user the owner of the database called vCloud. And you're done. You could change any of these values that you want. It's up to you. I'm going to leave it default. The only thing I changed was the password, and up here the paths. So there's a play button up here. I'm going to hit the play button. Let's see what's going on here. That looks good. Making sure there's nothing remnant in here. Nope, that looks good too. There we go. Now we have executed the script. Basically, down here, it'll say query executed successfully. How can you check to make sure it was actually successful? Well, first you tell the program improvement thing to go away. Then you go to the logins and refresh it. And there's our vCloud user. Now, if I get properties on the vCloud user, we can see that that person is mapped to vCloud, and it's a DBO, database owner. Great, that's what we wanted. You should also notice with a little refresh magic, there's a new database called vCloud. And if I expand that out, we should be able to see in security a user called vCloud. There he is. So he's associated to that database. And if I get properties on this database, I'll be able to see the permissions. I can see vCloud as a user of the database. So everything ran great. The query executed successfully is what we want. I'm going to click OK or cancel because I don't want to change anything. The database portion is now done. I mean, really all you did was you imported a query by copying, pasting scripts, changed the path, and set a password on a user right down here. That's it. Not that bad. All right, now that the database is created, we need to make a virtual machine running Red Hat Enterprise Linux Server to actually put vCloud Director on. Now, if you don't already have rel as a template somewhere, you'll have to go and grab it. So let me show you where you can grab the installation file. Now keep in mind, Red Hat Enterprise Linux is not free. So I can show you how to do an evaluation, but otherwise you're going to need to have an actual support contract with Red Hat in order to use this past the 30 days. So if you go on the web, you'll see if you go to redhat.com, you get something like this, and there's a customer portal link right here. You can click on that. It'll open a new page. And then there's a bunch of choices. So we want to do a download under Red Hat Enterprise Linux that says Evaluations and Demos. Click on that. And right here, Red Hat Enterprise Linux 30-day evaluation. So that's what you'll want to do. And let's show all the content. There we go. So then download the free evaluation. Keep going down the rabbit hole. There we go. Okay, so you'll notice I can basically fill out my information and I can get a demo of Red Hat. So let me do all the stuff in asterisks. So I am just a poor little end user, and I just intend this to do for this for education. Great. Submit the request. And there you go. They will send you an email that includes information on how to download the file. Now I can go back to downloads. Okay, so now basically Red Hat's going to evaluate your request to do an evaluation. That's kind of circular there. And once they clear you for it, you can download the file. You're going to want Red Hat Enterprise Linux version 6.2 or 6 Update 2. And it downloads, I would say about 3 gigs or so. So I've gone ahead and downloaded my supported version of RHEL 6.2 under my support contract. If you're waiting on your eval email, it usually takes, no more than a day. It's usually, for me, it's like 15 or 20 minutes and you'll get it. And then just follow the link and download it. Or if you have a support contract, just go under your support contract and download it. Now I'm going to walk through creating the new virtual machine that you'll need in order to build the vCloud director using RHEL. So I've got a folder here called demo, and we'll make a new virtual machine in this demo folder. Now this is my management cluster in the lab. I'm not building anything in my resource cluster. So to begin with, we want a custom virtual machine so that we get more options. You notice if I click typical, some of the CPU options go away. They come out here if I click custom. Click next on that. New virtual machine. I am very lazy with names, so I'm just going to call it VCD, just because I only have one of them anyways. But make this as descriptive as you want. Again, it's the logical name that you chose. I'm going to put it in the lab, which is my management cluster. And I'm not putting it in a resource pool. In another lesson, I went a little deeper on resource pools, but basically that's a way we can carve out the physical resources into kind of logical containers. And it's just really not necessary for this kind of install. I'm going to put it on the data store that I use for virtual machines. And I'm going to make it a virtual machine version 8. That way I get all the cool bells and whistles that come with the latest virtual machine. And then I want to choose Linux. Now, fortunately, when you click Linux, it defaults to Red Hat Enterprise Linux 6, 64-bit. That's important. We want a 64-bit server. I'm going to give it just one core, which is plenty, and 2 gigs of RAM. That'll serve. If you have more, give it more, but 1 CPU and 2 gigs of RAM is really okay for a lab environment. That's not going to tax those resources in any real significant way. Now, this is important. Give it 2 NICs, because remember, we need 2 IPs, one for console and one for web, so we need 2 NICs. I'm going to put them both on my virtual machine port group, and I'm going to leave the default VMXNet 3, which is the higher performing, more fancy NIC, as opposed to the E1000, which is more legacy. I'm going to go ahead and choose LSI Logic SAS for this particular install. I just don't want to deal with the drivers of the paravirtual, and the performance on this particular virtual machine is really not that critical anyways. Make a new virtual machine disk. The default 16 gig, I'm fine with that, and because I'm on NFS, it's going to thin provision that disk. If you want to do thick provision, you're more than welcome, but to me that's kind of a waste. Thin provision, especially for a lab, is a great way to go. So if you're in production and you're putting this in, it's more, you could argue more towards thick, but in a lab environment, if you're learning with this, I would just go thin. We're going to accept the default SCSI location, which is 00, and we really don't have any reason to put this disk anywhere other than the primary 00 location, although you're more than welcome to change to any of these that you want. And there we go. We have a summary of what's going to be built. The main thing is that we have 2 networks and that we have a disk. I'd say at least 10 gigs or bigger. The 16 default is plenty. And click Finish. And it's going to build that empty shell of a virtual machine. And there it is. All right, the next thing you'll want to do is insert the ISO that you downloaded that contains RHEL 6.2. In my case, I'm going to edit the virtual machine, click on the CD drive, and I have the file on one of my data stores. So I'm going to click Data Store ISO File and Browse. And notice I have a data store with just ISOs in it. Open that up, sort by names, and there it is. RHEL 6.2 dvd.iso. So like I said, about 3 gigs, and that's what the file name roughly looks like. I put the boot on there just so you can see that. You might think, oh, 236 megabytes for this boot ISO. I'm going to grab that. That is not the right file. You want to make sure you grab the dvd.iso. Click OK, and make sure to connect it at power on. Now, if you had it maybe on your machine and you were going to pass it through, then you could do your client device, or if you had it in the server itself, you could do host device. It's your choice, but I'm going to do it that way. And there we go. Now I can power it on, and I'll open the console, and we'll get to go through this fun wizard. Notice when you first start it up, you get 60 seconds to choose which one you want to do. So I'll go ahead and do the first option, install or upgrade an existing system. Hit enter, and it's going to go through this little bit of text here. And when it gets to the GUI, it kind of goes a little bigger than my screen, so I'm going to have to shrink it just a tad. and we'll work with the arrows on the sides to get it to install. So the first option is to choose to test the media. I'm perfectly comfortable with this ISO. I know it's good to go. So I'm going to skip the test. To me, that's more for legacy physical media, like a physical CD. We don't need to really test it for a digital ISO. Okay, so now I'm going to move the screen a little bit. I'm going to shrink this just a tad so that you can see it. There we go. And you'll see, at first, if you have a smaller screen, like I'm running a smaller resolution, you might think, okay, now what? I just see an arrow and a guy with a hat on. Well, it's hiding down here in the bottom right corner. Here's the buttons for next. So you can either click next or you can hit Alt-N. That's why it's underscored. So next. Or you can drag this little mouse here, little black mouse. So next. And for the most part, instead of clicking next, I'm going to tell you that I'm doing next and just hit Alt-N, just so we don't have to drag this thing around all the time. So let me move it back over here. And I'm going to choose English and hit Alt-N, which is next. And again, US English is fine for my keyboard style, Alt-N. And let me drag this back up here. There we go. What kind of devices are we going to install? Just basic storage devices. We don't need anything specialized here. So make sure you're on the first radio button, Alt-N to go next. And it's letting me know that there might be some data on this disk, but you and I both know I just created this thing, so there's no way there's any data on here. So I'm going to say, yes, you can discard the data. I'm fine with that. Now we need to give the virtual machine a name. I'm going to call it vcd.glacier.local. So remember when I said you need to pick a DNS name, an A record. That's the record that I made in DNS, was VCD. My domain is glacier.local, so the full name of the host is vcd.glacier.local. And we can click Alt-N again for next. Now I need to pick out my time zone, which is my city, and I am in Chicago, so I'll scroll all the way up to Chicago. I'm glad that they list all these cities for you because I'm sure that's very important instead of just different time zones. But, you know, my mouse is moving a little crazy here. There we go, Chicago. Alt-N for next. Now I need a root password. So in a lab, a lot of times I'll just use one password over and over because I don't want to have to remember 30 different passwords for an environment that really no one cares to hack into anyways. If this is your production system, make it really hard, make it complex, write it down into a password safe. I'm just going to use a very simple password, and you'll see what happens when I do. So I'm using password, and it's going to say, man, that's a terrible password. Are you sure you want to use this really weak password? And fortunately, you're the admin, so you can tell it, yeah, I want to use that anyways. And it's not going to say anything else beyond that. But for the most part, if you get that warning in a production environment, it means try again, your password's too easy. For this, I'm going to use all the space, and then click Next or Alt-N for next. And it's going to say, are you sure you want to do this? I'm about to nuke parts of the disk. Are you absolutely cool with it? Yes, I'm cool with that. Write those changes to the disk. And it's going to do all that work for me. And it's kind of like Kit from Knight Rider with the things whipping back and forth. Now you get an option, what kind of server do you want to do? We're just going to do basic server. I'm not even going to go over the other stuff. It's completely irrelevant for this install. So just leave it on basic server. And then let me grab the side here. We'll go down here and I'll just show you that I'm just clicking next. I'm not doing any of the other stuff. Oop, there we go. Gets a little squirrely on you. The mouse can be a little funky when VMware Tool is not installed. Okay, so now you'll see it's going to install like 600 different packages. You might think, haha, that's funny, he's kidding. No, I'm not kidding. 624 packages. So we'll let that install, and I'll be right back. Okay, now you have a RHEL server. Congratulations. And you get the cool little splash screen, you know, telling you that you did a great job. So let me scroll down to the bottom here, and there's a reboot button. Before we click the reboot button, I like to eject the CD so that it doesn't try to boot up into it again. So I'm going to edit the settings, go to the CD, disconnect it, and set it back to the default of client device. That way, you won't have to deal with the ISO trying to do anything squirrely and reinstall a second time or something. Click reboot. And the cool thing now is we won't have to deal with that weird screen resolution. It'll be just command line at this point with a small screen, which is much easier to deal with. So we'll let this boot up. And once it gets to the install page, or the login page rather, we'll move on to the next step. All right, so we have the login prompt. I'm going to go ahead and log in just to have that ready to go. And the default login that I'm going to use is root, R-O-O-T. And the password I put in was that super secret word password, which ends up working because we told it, I don't care if it's easy, I want to use it. And it said, okay, you win, you're the boss. So now that we have vCloud Director server ready to go, we haven't installed the actual software yet, but we have the underlying server ready to go. We need to do a little more prep work. I know it's just tons of prep work in this thing, but don't worry, you're at the home stretch. We're going to make some SSL certificates. Specifically, we need to create 2 certificates, one for each NIC. So I've got the command here, and when you first look at it, you might think, wow, that is insanely difficult looking. Well, once I kind of crack exactly what this is doing apart, it becomes a lot less intimidating. I will say this, though. I've never actually been able to memorize this command. So if you do, give yourself a cookie, because I always have to look this thing up. Because it is quite so long and complicated. So let's break it down. We'll talk about the first command that you see. Key tool, that's a tool that we use to make or read certificates. So we're just calling key tool, that's the application itself. Then we're calling dash key store. We're telling it the key store we want to work with is called certificates.ks. So that's the key store. It's basically a file that contains keys. Key store. The store type is JCEKS. All that really means is that we have a repository that is of a Java format. It's a file format based on Java, or that relates to Java. It's really irrelevant in the install. That's the one we have to use that vCloud requires, but that's kind of what it stands for. Dash store pass is providing a password for the key store. I've highlighted it in red because that's not the password you typically want to use. That's the default password in the command that is given as an example, passwd. I will be using it here just because then I've got the default one, and in case you are following along with any of the scripts that VMware provides, you can be like, oh, it's passwd. But don't use that in production. All right, I've yelled at you enough. Let's move on. Dash validity is basically saying how long will this certificate be valid? And the number is the amount of days. So 9,999 days. That's right. By default, I think if you don't supply that, the certificate will be valid for, I think it's 3 or 4 months. Then you'll have to make a new one, and that's no fun. So I go ahead and make it valid for like 20 years or something like that. Then we want to tell it to dash gen key. We're saying we want to generate the key, and the key algorithm, or crypto that we're going to use, is the RSA crypto. And it's basically these 3 really smart dudes put together this way to jumble up the numbers to make a crypto key. It's definitely way over my head, but either way, we're going to use RSA as the algorithm that's used. The alias is kind of the name of the key, is HTTP. So there we go. You now have a complete understanding of all the different bits of this really long, complicated-looking key tool command. The second key tool command is pretty much the exact same thing. We're just making the alias console proxy. So 1 certificate for the web, 1 certificate for the console proxy, and that's it. That's all we're doing. It's just we're going to run these 2 commands basically. So let's dive right into the vCloud Director server and do this. All right, now that we're back on the vCloud Director command line, I'm going to go ahead and change to the root directory, which is just /, and I'm going to make a directory called prep. There we go. And I'm going to change into the directory called prep, because this is where I want to build all my stuff and put my software, and this is kind of like my holding place for everything we're going to be doing going forward. So first I'm going to run the command, key tool, key store, certificates is the name of the file that we're going to make using this key tool. The store type is JCEKS, which is like a Java type of file storage for keys. The store pass is passwd. Again, don't use that in production, just for labs. The validity is 9,999 days. We're going to generate the key using the key algorithm of the RSA crypto, and the alias will be HTTP. Whew, my fingers are tired. Oh, and I fat-fingered that right there. Want alias. not a list. There we go. So what is your first and last name? Don't answer that. That's not what it's actually asking. It wants to know the DNS name of the IP that'll be represented by this certificate. This is the web certificate, or HTTP. So we're going to be using vcd.glacier.local. That's the DNS name of my vCloud Director server. The organizational unit, we'll just call it IT department. Really doesn't matter what it is. My organization is Wall Network. My city is Chicago. I'm in Illinois and the US. Are we sure that's correct? Yes. Basically, it says the canonical name, which is kind of the who am I, is vcd.glacier.local. I work for the IT department of Wall Network in Chicago, Illinois, US. Yes, that's great. What password do we want to use? If you hit enter, it'll just use the same passwd of the key store. I'm cool with that. Put in whatever you want. I'm going to hit enter, and there we go. I'm going to hit the up arrow, do the same thing all over again, just delete the HTTP at the end, and put in the word console proxy. Hit enter. My console proxy is a different DNS name. It's vcd-console.glacier.local. I like to use a unique name for the console, just so I can differentiate the IPs in DNS. Again, IT department of Wall Network in Chicago, Illinois, US. Yes, I'm happy with that. I'll use the same password. I'm going to hit enter. There we go. You can run this command, keytool -store type jceks store passwd key store certificates.ks list, and it'll tell you, hey, there's my two certificates, console proxy and HTTP. All right, cool. So we're done with the SSL portion. We now have if I do a list here, we have a certificates.ks. I will say that when I list out the permissions, right now the certificates doesn't quite look right because you can only read the certificates. You can't execute it. It's missing, I put these arrows, it's missing the X's here. We have read for the user group and root, but we don't have any execute. So I'm going to do, this is something you'll need to do too, chmod, change the permissions to 555 for certificates. I'm going to type cert and then tab, it'll complete it. And there we go. If I up arrow twice back to the ls command, it's now green because you notice now everyone can execute that file. So that's important. Make sure to do that. Now that the SSL is completely done, we need to actually set up the personality of this server. Right now it's just a name and has some certs. We don't have any IPs, the firewall's still on, etc. So all I have to do is type setup, and we get this kind of pseudo GUI, the text mode setup utility. We're going to do two things. First, we're going to turn off the firewall. So arrow down to firewall, tab to run tool, and it has a star. If I hit space, poof, star goes away. We don't want the firewall turned on. It causes all sorts of problems. If you're really good with IP tables and you want to edit them yourself, feel free. I just end up turning this off. Hit OK, and it's going to say, hey, are you sure? You're going to be turning off the firewall. Yes, I'm absolutely sure we want to do that. Next, I go down to the network config. Just keep tabbing over to it, and then tab to run tool. We're going to do the device configuration because we need to set the IPs for both NICs. So the first one is ETH0. That's NIC 0. Hit enter. And you see the cursor. It's kind of hard to see. If I go down, there we go. USDHCP, hit space to get rid of that. Then down again, I'm going to edit the IPs. So this one is going to be for the web. I'm going to use 10.0.0.96. Put in my Class C subnet mask, my default gateway, and I only have one DNS server, so put that in there. Tab over and hit OK. Now, what's interesting is before we had to just use the lowest IP was web. Here we're going to get to choose. So I'm purposely putting this on ETH0, but that's not going to automatically default to the web IP. So OK, go to ETH1, hit enter on that, down, space to get rid of DHCP, and we'll put that IP in, 10.0.0.97. Class C mask, put in the gateway, 10.0.0.200, and the DNS server is 10.0.0.4. Hit OK. And we're good to go. Save that config. DNS configuration, we'll put that in now. You'll see it's already got the vcd.glacier.local, so it has the host name in properly. We're going to add a DNS entry of 10.0.0.4 and a search path of glacier.local. I'm just putting in the domain name for my search path because I only have one domain.
If you have more, you can put them in there. Hit OK, and tab over to save and quit, and then quit. I'm going to clear the screen just to get all this stuff off here. Now I'm going to run a command ifconfig-a for all. And what do you notice? If you look at eth0 and eth1, there's still no IP address. It's like it didn't work. Well, that's because there's usually one caveat we have to look at first before we can move forward. So I'll need you to go to change directory. We're going to go to esxi, that's etc or etc, but most people say esxi. Sysconfig network-scripts, hit enter, and then we're going to look and see what's in here. So I'm going to list everything, and if I go up, there we go. We got an ifconfig-eth0 and an ifconfig-eth1. We're going to edit those two files. So I'm going to run vi and then ifcfg-eth0. So we're basically using a text editor within Linux to edit this file. Run this one first. Now, the problem is on boot equals no should be on boot equals yes. So we're going to hit the letter I is insert, and you see at the bottom it says insert now. Scroll down to on boot, and just using my arrow keys, I'm going in front of no, I'm hitting delete to get rid of it, and I'm typing yes. That's it. I'm going to hit escape, which takes me out of insert mode. Then colon, you see at the bottom I got a colon, WQ. That means write the save change, so basically write those changes and then quit. There we go. And now it says it wrote the file. I'm going to hit up arrow and change eth0 to eth1, and we're just going to do the same thing. Enter that. Again, on boot no should be on boot yes. Hit I to insert. Arrow on to on boot no. Change that to yes. Hit escape to get out of insert, and then colon WQ for write quit. And there we go. Now all I should have to do is run a service network restart. And now I'll actually bring up those IP addresses. I'm going to run ifconfig all again, -a. And now you can see, it's a little hard to see, there's the 96 on eth0 and the 97 on eth1. So we have IP addresses. So we've got all our IP addresses configured, we've got DNS configured, we turned off the firewall, and we have the SSL certs. The next step before we actually install vCloud Director is we need to copy the file over, and we need to copy over one other file. That's that libxdmcp file that we talked about earlier. So here I've downloaded a file called WinSCP. It's a program that I'm going to run, and this allows me to transfer files very easily between my desktop and the Linux server. So I'm going to put in that new IP that I got there, 10.0.0.96. Use the root account with the password of password, and I'm going to change the protocol to SCP. And it's going to say, hey, I don't know this fingerprint. This key is not in my database. Is this okay? Do you trust this guy? Yeah, it's going to say that the first time you connect to anything. So yes, I'm cool with that. And we're going to get kind of like a file explorer. It's a very familiar looking, way to go. So I'm going to go on the Linux server. Oh, by the way, the Linux server is on the right, and my Windows desktop is on the left. So I'm getting into the root up here. It's /root. And then there's my prep folder right there with my certificates file. I'm now going to go into my file server for my vCloud stuff, because that's where I downloaded my bin file right here for vCloud Director. So I'm going to throw that over there, copy that over there. It's going to copy, and I'm going to grab this libxdmcp file that I downloaded. And that was the one we discussed a little earlier, where I've got the short URL where you can go grab it yourself too. It's only, 22 meg, something like that? Or 22K. It's very tiny. Okay, now I'm grabbing that libxdmcp file, and it should copy very quickly. Poof, like it wasn't even there. All right, so I'm gonna get all this out of the way. Go back to here. Let's go into the prep folder. I'm gonna change directory to /prep, and we'll do a list, see what's in here. All right, so we have the files, but they're currently not usable. They're only readable, and we can't execute them, which won't work. So what we're going to do is we're going to change the permissions on those, change mod 555 for the lib file. I'm just typing lib and then tab. And
And I'm going to do the same thing for the VMware file. Just VMware tab, it'll complete it. And then we do a list again. And there we go. They're all green. We can read and execute all of those, which is what we want. So the first thing I'm going to do is install that libxdmcp file. For that, you've got to run rpm install or -i. Start typing lib and then tab. It'll finish it. And hit enter. And that's it. Done. It's in. Very simple, very painless. Okay, we are ready to install vCloud Director on the server. Give yourself a nice pat on the back for getting this far. Now I've gone ahead and cleared off the screen, so let's verify that the installer is in here. I'm just going to do a look in the prep folder. There it is, the VMware bin file. Just do // I'm going to type VMware and hit tab, and there we go. It'll start doing the install of the packages, and it'll ask us to run the configuration script once that's done. So, do we want to run the script now? I think we do. Let's hit yes. There we go. So, the first thing you have to choose is which IP on which NIC will be the web service or HTTP service. If you remember in another lesson on the appliance, it just chooses the lowest IP. But you can choose here. So I'm going to choose the .96 for the web, and I'm only left with 97 for console proxy. So guess what I'm going to choose for that? 1 for 97. Now we need the path to where the certs are. So I'm going to type /prep certificates.ks. If I fat fingered it and goofed it up like .k, it'll say, oh, there's nothing there. So you have to type it in right, or else it won't even let you go any further. Just wanted to show you that. So if you give it the right path, it's going to want the password, which mine is passwd. And it's going to want a syslog host name for sending the logs. It's optional. I'm going to skip it on this. If you have one, great. I don't have one. Now, database. All right, so we set up a Microsoft SQL database. So I'm going to hit 2 for Microsoft SQL. And the host name, remember, I have the lazy man's lab. So mine's sql.glacier.local. So I don't want to have to find that thing. The database port is default. Hit enter. My database name is vCloud. We didn't change that, so I can hit enter. And the instance is default. I don't have any other fancy instances, so I can hit enter again for default. The username, again, is default. It's vCloud is the user that it sets up by default. And then the password, which in my case is very secret, literally. And you'll see, if you see this, this is good. This means that you connected the database correctly because it's running all the SQL scripts to build the tables and schema that it needs within SQL. If you get an error or it sends you back to the beginning, you know that you goofed up the IP or maybe the username or something like that. You need to go back to the database and fix it somehow. But this is a positive sign. Now at the very end, it's going to say, I'm going to launch the service if you want me to. And this would be maybe if you were getting it prepped but you didn't want to run it right now. So I'm going to say yes, start it now. I'm happy with that. The 2 services will start, but I'll caution you, it's typically about a minute before you can actually reach the vCloud Director web portal. So I'm going to let this bake for just a minute, and through the magic of video, when I come back, it should be ready to rock. Alright, so it's been about a minute. I will go to https bcd.glacier.local. It's already filled in because I already checked it. And just like magic, there it is. Like I said, if you get a gray screen or something like that, you just need to wait a little longer. It's still setting up the service. And there you go. It's now ready to be configured and become a real vCloud Director server. That concludes this lesson. I hope you found the information valuable, and I'll see you in the next lesson.